Some stories begin with a single moment of courage but this story starts with humiliation, rejection, and a woman who refused to look the other way when in right before her eyes. Welcome back. Tell me from which city you are watching me and what time it is. Now, listen to this story. Elena Rodriguez stood at the crossroads between survival and dignity. At 34, her hands bore the calluses of 2 jaws. Her eyes carried the weight of and her heart held the fierce love only a single mother knows. The bustling marketplace of San Miguel had become her second home, where vendors called out prices in melodic voices and the aroma of fresh bread passing buses. But on this particular Thursday afternoon, something would happen that would shatter the invisible walls between worlds. The sun blazed mercilessly as Elena hurried through the narrow aisles between fruit stands and clothing vendors. Her 8-year-old son Mateo waited at home, probably doing homework at their small kitchen table, the same table where she counted make ends meet. The weight of grocery bags cut into this was her reality. This was survival. Then she heard it. The cruel laughter that makes 3 young men inexpensive. Their voices carried that particular brand of arrogance. The old man stood perfectly, his weathered hands gripping his dignity intact despite the mockery raining down. What would you have done? Would you have walked past, like so did that day? Her groceries suddenly felt not as heavy as the silence followed each cruel word. The old man wore a simple white shirt, clean dark pants that had seen his silver hair was neat like everything. He maintained an almost regal posture. The leader of the group, a young man with perfectly styled hair, a watch that probably cost more than Elena made months, sneered at the elderly gentleman. His words cut through the afternoon air like broken glass. Elena watched as the old man's shoulders tensed, jaw tightened, but he remained silent. That silence spoke louder than any without thinking. Elena stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from pure righteousness. She positioned herself between the bullies and their target. Her 5'4" frame somehow larger in that moment. Grocery bags fell to the work-worn appearance. They left, but not before making it clear they didn't matter in their world. The marketplace slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Vendors went back to calling prices. Children ran between the stalls. Life continued as if nothing happened. But everything had changed. The elderly gentleman looked at Elena, thanked her quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected weight of authority despite his humble appearance. When Elena offered to help him carry his purchases, slightly declined. Pride, she recognized. She knew it well. But as he walked away, something nagged at her. The way he carried himself, the careful way he spoke, the dignity that couldn't be touched by insults or mockery. Who was this man? And why did those young bullies target him specifically? Elena gathered her scattered groceries, her mind racing. In a world where the poor were expected to be invisible, where single mothers like her were supposed to keep their heads down and mouths shut, she had chosen to speak up. She had no idea that this single act of courage would unravel the highest towers of power in days past. But Elena couldn't forget She found herself looking for the elderly gentleman every time she visited them. She finally spotted him again, sitting alone on a worn bench near the fountain. He approached despite her usual shyness. His name was Don Julio, he told her. Elena invited him for tea at her modest apartment, a gesture that surprised them both. Something about his loneliness mother in an unforgiving. The walk to her neighborhood took them through that told the story of inequality with brutal honesty. Cracked sidewalks gave way to pothole-filled roads, colorful murals decoratively crumbling. Children played soccer with makeshift goals while their mothers hung. Elena's apartment was small but spotless. Every piece of furniture had been careful functionality rather than the walls were covered with Mateo's drawing certificates. The kitchen smelled of the rice and beans that had become their stretched to last as long as possible. Julio sat at the same table where Mateo did his homework. He brewed hibiscus tea in her only cups, the ones her mother had given her before she. As they talked, Elena noticed something extraordinary about her guest. Despite his simple clothes and humble, Julio spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to respect. His hands, though aged, moved with the precision of someone who had once. When Mateo came home from school, his backpack worn and patched but his smile brilliant, his entire demeanor changed. The old man's eyes softened as he listened to the chatter about his day. Elena watched this interaction with growing curiosity. There was something paternal, almost grandfatherly, in the way Don Julio responded to her son. But it was what Don Julio didn't say that intrigued her. When Mateo asked about his family, Julio's face clouded over. He spoke of a son, successful in business, but the words came out heavy with unspoken pain. A grandson he barely knew. Decisions made years ago that had consequences he was still living. Elena recognized the weight of regret, her own version of it every day, wondering if she was making sacrifices were enough. Love could compensate for everything they lacked. Over the following weeks, Don Julio became a regular. Elena discovered he lived alone, surviving on a small pension that covered his basic needs. He was proud, too proud to accept direct help, but he gratefully shared the simple meal. During these visits, Elena learned about Don Julio. He had owned a small business once, something to do with construction and development. Spoke of principles and values, of choosing integrity over profit. of decisions that had cost him everything but his soul. Elena found herself drawn to this in a world that measured worth by bank accounts and social. Don Julio possessed something that couldn't be bought or sold. His presence in her small apartment brought a sense of dignity that she hadn't realized was missing, but questions multiplied in her. Why did those young men at the market exactly how to hurt him? What kind of business success could his son have in a way that would challenge everyone? One evening, as Elena helped Don Julio navigate the crowded waiting room of the local health clinic, a television mounted near the reception desk caught her attention. The evening news was broadcasting from an elegant hotel ballroom, where the country's business elite had gathered. The camera focused on a man in an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and practiced. A reporter's voice filled the waiting. Andrés Valenzuela, founder and CEO of one of the country's largest technology and construction companies, a man whose business empire had made him casual disinterest of some. Then she noticed Don Julio. The old man had gone completely still, his face pale, his hands gripping the arms of his plastic chair so tight knuckles turned white. The resemblance was unmistakable once you— the same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same authoritative bearing that Don Julio carried despite his humble circumstance. Have you ever had a moment when the ground beneath— when everything you thought you knew about someone— Elena stared at the screen, then at Don Julio. The reporter continued her glowing coverage of Andrés Valenzuela's philanthropic efforts, his company's expansion plans, his status as one of the country's most influential businessmen. All while his father sat in a public health clinic waiting room, wearing the same simple shirt him in for weeks. Silence between them stretched like a chasm. Other patients coughed and shifted in their seats. A baby cried somewhere behind. The fluorescent lights hummed over, casting everything in the harsh glare of institutional indifference. Finally, Don Julio's voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he confirmed. Andrés was his son. The son he hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. The son whose company's aggressive expansion had forced countless small businesses to close, including many in the very neighborhood. Elena felt the world tilt slightly. Elderly gentleman the man she had invited into her home, person who had become like father of the most powerful businessman in the— a man whose decisions affected thousands of lives, whose company's policies had indirectly contributed to the economic struggle. Exactly like Elena. The irony was devastating. She had stood up for the father of a man whose business practices represented everything she stood against. But as she looked at Don Julio's pained expression, she realized the story was far more complicated than simple wealth and poverty. In the days that followed, Don Julio gradually revealed the full scope of his estrangement from Andrés. They had once worked together, father and son, building a small construction company with honest labor and fair practices. But as opportunities for expansion arose, their philosophies had diverged dramatically. Andrés wanted to embrace the cutthroat tactics that characterized big business: cheap labor, corner cutting, aggressive competition that destroyed smaller companies. Don Julio had insisted on maintaining their profit if it meant growing more slowly. Profit. Conflict had escalated over months. Father and son had stopped being able to have didn't end in arguments. Andrés accused his father of being naive, and Julio accused his son of— the final break had come when Andrés decided to buy out his father's share of the business. A small, principled construction company became the corporate empire built on exactly the kind of practices Don Julio— Elena listened to this story with growing under— Don Julio hadn't just lost his business and his fortune. He had lost his son to a world that valued profit over people, success over integrity, power over family bonds. But the story was about to become even more personal. As she researched Andrés Valenzuela's company using the slow internet connection at the local, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Valenzuela Enterprises had— their target was the San Miguel Opt, where Mateo went to school. Dozens of small vendors barely eked vegetables. Company's plans called for demolishing the entire modern shopping complex that would attract wealthier consumers across the city. Small vendors who had worked the same stalls for decades would be displaced. Affordable housing in the surrounding block would be torn down to make way for upscale apartments. Andrés Valenzuela's company was the community that his father now called home. She felt sick as she printed out the news articles and development plans. The photographs of the proposed shopping complex showed manicured landscape and parking spaces for cars. There was no provision for relocating the displaced vendors, no affordable housing included in the development plan. Young men who had humiliated probably worked for Valenzuela, and they had recognized the old man as the father of their powerful boss, and their cruelty had been intentional, calculated to send a message. Elena walked home through the marketplace, she now looking at it with new eyes. Mrs. Carmen, who sold the freshest tomatoes and always gave Mateo a piece of— Miguel, the elderly man who repaired that moved like an artist, keeping Elena's work shoes functional month after month. Rosa, the young mother who sold empanadas. All of these people, small businesses that form the heartbeat of the community, would be swept away to make room for progress and profit. That evening, Mateo was in his room working on a project about his neighborhood, innocently unaware that the place he was describing might not exist much longer. Don Julio had stayed for dinner, as had become his custom, and now he sat across from Elena, his face grave as he read the development plans. The silence between them was heavy with implications. Elena had defended Don Julio against his son's employees, not knowing the connection. She had welcomed him into her home, into her family's life. not understanding that his son was preparing to destroy. But looking at Don Julio's aggression, Elena realized that this situation was causing him even more pain, causing her. He was watching his son prepare to. The people who had treated him with dignity despite his humble circumstances were about to lose everything to his son's ambitions. What would you do in Elena's situation? Would you blame Don Julio for? Would you feel betrayed by the connection you had discovered? Elena surprised herself with her response. Instead of anger or accusation, she felt a fierce determination within her. This wasn't Don Julio's fault. If anything, his presence in her life had given her something precious. The knowledge that this development project had both in the man whose company and the father who opposed everything it represented. Vision that night that would change the lives of everyone. She would fight the development project, would stand up for her community the same Julio in the marketplace. But she would not do it alone. She would ask Don Julio to help her understand the business world that Andres inhabited, to help her find weaknesses in the development plans, help her build a strategy that might actually succeed against overwhelming corporate power. Don Julio's response surprised her. Despite his age, despite his estrangement from despite the obvious pain this situation caused him, he agreed immediately. For the first time since Elena had met him, she saw fire in his eyes, a glimpse of the businessman he had once been, the father who had never stopped loving his son even while opposing everything he had become. The fight for San Miguel was about to begin. If this story is moving you, don't forget to like and subscribe because your support allows us to keep sharing. Elena's first step was to attend a community meeting at the local building that had served the neighborhood 50 years and was also slated for demolition. Parish Hall was crowded with vendors, residents, and local business owners, all buzzing with anxiety. Father Martinez, the elderly priest who had baptized Mateo and dozens of other children from the community, stood at the front of the room trying to restore. His voice was gentle but firm as he explained what he knew about Valenzuela, and Elena had never spoken at a community meeting before. He was accustomed to keeping her head down, working hard, and avoiding confrontation. Single mothers, especially those struggling financially, learned early to make themselves situations that might draw. But as she listened to the fear and lifted inside her, Carmen worried about how she would feed her grandchildren if she lost her tomato stand. Miguel spoke about the arthritis that made it possible for him to seek employment. Rosa quietly wept as she described her inability to afford rent anywhere else in the. Elena stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice was clear as she spoke about dignity, about the value of their community, about the right to exist in the city where they had been born. More importantly, she offered hope. She had been researching development projects, studying the legal requirements for urban planning, learning about environmental impact assessments and community Valenzuela enterprises required to navigate. The response from her neighbors was some were encouraged by her knowledge and passion. Others were skeptical that a single mother with no political. Elena understood their skepticism. 3 months earlier, she would have shared it. But 3 months earlier, she hadn't met Don Julio, hadn't learned that principles were powerful than profit, that dignity was something that couldn't be bought or sold, that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who had everything to lose and over the following weeks, Elena with an intensity that including herself. She attended city council meetings, learning to navigate the bureaucratic language that disguised important decisions behind layers of technical. She discovered that several community leaders had already by representatives of Valenzuela offered significant payments in exchange for the revelation that some of her neighbors were willing to sell out the community for money. Devastating, but it also clarified the scope of the challenge she faced. Meanwhile, her relationship with Don Julio deepened as they worked together on research. The old man's business experience proved invaluable as he legal documents and development timelines. But Elena also noticed the stress of fighting against his son's health. He seemed frailer, more tired, and some caught him staring into space, expression of profound sadness. One evening, as they sat at Elena's kitchen table, Julio made a confession that he revealed that he still held legal rights to a piece of property that was crucial to the development. Years earlier, when he and Andres had dissolved their business partnership, Don Julio had retained ownership of a small lot adjacent to the market. It was worthless by itself, but it provided the only viable access point for the construction equipment that would be needed to demolish the existing buildings. Without that property, Valenzuela Enterprises would have to completely redesign their development plans, adding millions to the cost, and potentially making the entire project unprofitable. Elena stared at him in amazement. Why hadn't he mentioned this crucial? Don Julio's answer revealed his internal conflict. Using the property as leverage against his son felt like a betrayal of their family, even though that bond had already been broken years earlier. But seeing the impact of Andres's plans, seeing the fear in children's eyes as they walked past surveyors' equipment, seeing elderly vendors like himself, had convinced him that some principles were more important than family loyalty. Elena realized that Don Julio was preparing to sacrifice his last hope of reconciliation with his son in order to help save her community. The weight of this decision, and its implications for both men, was almost overwhelming. But before she could fully process this revelation, a more immediate crisis. Her employer, the cleaning company where she worked second office buildings downtown, called her into a meeting with the supervisor. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman with brown, explained that Elena's political problems. Several of the office buildings owned by companies with business relationships to Valenzuela Enterprises. Her public opposition to the development seen as a conflict, Elena was given a choice: stop her community organizing activities or lose her job. The threat was delivered politely, almost apologetically, but the message was unmistakable. In a city where jobs were scarce and single mothers were speaking out against powerful Elena walked home that night feeling the full weight of the decision before her. Without her cleaning job, she and Mateo would lose their apartment. He would be forced to move in with relatives and disrupting Mateo's education and destroying any possibility of continuing the fight for San Miguel. But accepting the ultimatum would mean a community and her own sense of integrity. It would mean teaching Mateo that survival required silence in the face of injustice. At home, she found Don Julio's face etched with concern. He had heard about the pressure being placed, about jobs being threatened, guilt over his son's act. That night, Elena made another decision possible to her just months. She quit her cleaning job before the next morning she woke up unemployed, facing eviction, responsible for feeding and housing an 8-year-old son, and committed to fighting the most powerful businessman in the country. She also woke up with something she had never, certainty that she was doing the right thing. Have you ever had to choose between financial security and have you ever risked everything you had for something you believed in? Elena's decision to leave her job sent ripples through the community. Some neighbors viewed her sacrifice with admiration and involvement in the resistance. Others worried that she had become too radical, too confrontational, and they began to distance themselves from the opposition campaign. The pressure on Elena's family intensified. Grocery shopping became a careful calculation of necessity funds. The electricity bill went unpaid and the water bill. Elena spent sleepless nights staring at the sea, wondering if her pride was worth her son's security. During the day, her organizing work took on new. Without the constraints of employment, she could attend every city council meeting, every public hearing, every community gathering to the development project. She also had more time to spend with Don Julio, and during their long conversations, she began to understand the true knowledge about the construction. Despite his humble circumstances, Don Julio possessed decades of experience that proved invaluable in analyzing and identifying potential vulnerabilities. Together, they discovered significant flaws in the environmental impact assessment. The proposed development would would likely cause flooding in the surrounding neighborhood during the rainy season. More importantly, they found evidence that the company had underestimated the cost of relocating properly account for the complex underground infrastructure that's marketplace and surrounding buildings. These technical violations provided legitimate grounds for challenging the through official channels, transforming Elena's grassroots campaign into a sophisticated legal and political strategy. But the most significant breakthrough came when Don Julio introduced Elena to someone, environmental engineer named Carlos Mendez, who had worked with Don Julio's original construction company years earlier, and who now held a senior position with the city's planning. Carlos was a quiet man in his 50s, graying temples and hands stained permanently with ink from architectural drawings. He had watched Andres Valenzuela's rise to power with growing concern, remembering the principled young man's father before ambition corrupted his values. Carlos reviewed the development plans with Elena. His professional assessment was damning. Valenzuela Enterprises had cut a possible corner, ignored numerous safety regulations, and submitted documentation that was deliberately misleading. With Carlos's help, Elena prepared a comprehensive challenge development project, complete with professional engineering, environmental impact study, and detailed legal arguments. For the first time since the fight began, she felt like she had weapons that might actually be effective against corporate power. But Andres Valenzuela had not built his empire by allowing small obstacles to stop his plan. Elena first became aware of the corporate counterattack when to find two men in expensive suits waiting outside. They introduced themselves as representatives of a community development foundation affiliated with Valenzuela Enterprises. A proposal for her. The offer was seductive in its Elena would receive a lucrative position as a community liaison coordinator, helping to ensure that local residents were treated. Her salary would be triple what she had earned at the cleaning, health insurance for herself, and a guaranteed housing allowance that would allow them to move to a much better. All she had to do was withdraw her opposition to the development and use her influence to convince other residents to accept the relocation packages. Elena listened to the proposal with growing disgust. They weren't trying to bribe her, they explained. They were offering her an opportunity to help her community while improving her own family's circumstances. She would be making a positive difference, they insisted, just from within the system instead of outside it. When Elena declined immediately and the men's demeanor changed, they politely reminded her that single mothers had very limited employment options. They mentioned that Mateo was a gifted student who deserved opportunities for advance. They suggested that idealism was a luxury, that the threats were never explicit, but the message was clear. Accept the offer or face consequences that would extend Elena herself to. After the men left, Elena sat in her kitchen, trembling with anger, and corporate machine had identified her as a threat and was prepared to use every tool at its disposal: money, intimidation, exploitation of her love, all deployed with calculating precision. Don Julio arrived an hour later to find Elena still sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the business card the corporate representatives had. When she told him about the encounter, his face went through a series of shame, rage, and finally, a grim determination that she had. That night, Don Julio made a decision that would probably alter his relationship with called a lawyer and began the process of transferring, ensuring that she would have the block the development project, regardless of any other pressure. But Andres Valenzuela, the next phase of corporate, Elena began to notice changes in how some conversations stopped when she approached. Invitations to community gatherings were not, even some of the vendors who had ignored the resistance movement act distant and suspicious. Elena eventually learned the public relations firm to spread rumors about her. She was described as an outside agitator with connections. Her single motherhood was portrayed as evidence of poor judgment and unstable. Her sudden unemployment was presented as proof that she was liable and possibly involved in illegal character assassination campaign. Single mothers were still viewed with suspicion by some. Political activism was associated with dangerous radicalism by people who remembered previous decades. Unemployment was often seen as a personal. Elena found herself increasingly defending not just the marketplace and the neighborhood. The stress began to affect her health and her relationship with who couldn't understand why his mother seemed sad. The corporate campaign also had an unintended consequence. Some community members who had been new, they recognized the tactics being used and resented being treated as pawns in a larger corporate strategy. A counter-movement began to emerge, led by Father Martinez and supported by several longtime residents who remembered Elena's kindness and generosity over the years. These neighbors had seen her share food when they had watched her help elderly residents and assist other single mothers with child. The community began to polarize, with families and neighbors choosing conflict that extended far beyond the original development. But Elena's core support group remained committed to the fight, and their dedication gave her strength to continue despite the personal attacks and mounting financial. The turning point came when Andres Valenzuela made a critical, believing that he had successfully isolated and discredited Elena. He decided to visit the San Miguel marketplace personally for a public relations photo opportunity. The visit was carefully staged by his communications team. Andres would walk through the marketplace with vendors and residents before finalizing the development. Local media were invited to cover the visit, and several city officials accompanied Andres to show support for his company's investment. Elena learned about the planned visit through Carlos, the environmental engineer, who had contacts within the city planning. He realized immediately that this was an opportunity to confront directly, to force him to address the human consequences. Morning of the visit, Elena woke up before dawn. She dressed carefully in her best clothes. This outfit she wore to job interviews and wanted to look respectable, professional, like someone whose opinions deserved. Don Julio had offered to accompany her, but Elena convinced him to stay away. The media coverage would focus on the dramatic confrontation between the organizer and the wealthy businessman. Having Andres' father present would shift attention to their family conflict and away from the broader issues affecting the community. Elena arrived at the marketplace 2 hours before Andres was. She positioned herself near the fountain where she had first met Don Julio, in the exact spot where she had witnessed him humiliated by the corporate employees months earlier. The symbolism was not accidental. When Andres Valenzuela arrived, surrounded by bodyguards, city officials, and media representatives, Elena was waiting. She had prepared remarks, but when she saw him in person for the first time, her carefully planned speech disappeared from her mind. Part about Mrs. Carmen's, about Miguel's shoe repair skills, about Rosa's empanadas that kept families fed when she talked about children who walked to school through these streets every day, about elderly residents who had lived out small businesses that provided employment and services that would never be replaced by an upscale shopping complex. Andres listened politely, his expression carefully neutral. When Elena finished speaking, responded with the kind of corporate language that said nothing while sounding reasonable. He spoke about economic development, about job creation, about bringing modern amenities to But Elena noticed something in his eyes. Exactly. Recognition, perhaps. Surprise at her articulate, maybe even a flicker of discomfort at having to defend his project against such The confrontation lasted less than, but it generated significant media coverage. Elena's passionate defense of her community was contrasted with Andres' polished but impersonal corporate responses. The visual imagery was powerful. The single mother facing down the billionaire, the community organizer speaking truth to power. That evening, Elena watched the news coverage at dawn, sitting on his narrow bed for reception. Don Julio was quiet as he watched his son on screen, his face revealing complex emotions that Elena couldn't fully interpret. When the news segment ended, Don Julio turned to Elena. Pride, she realized. He was proud of her courage, her intelligence, her refusal to be intimidated by power and wealth. But he was also proud of something else, something that took Elena a moment to understand. For the first time in years, Don Julio had seen his son forced to defend his decision, forced to acknowledge that his business practices affected real people. Andres might not have changed his mind, but had been reminded that his actions had human consequences. And sometimes, Don Julio suggested quietly, being reminded of our humanity is the first. Media coverage of Elena began receiving calls facing similar development. Environmental groups offered technical assistance with legal challenges. Law students volunteered to help with recent document preparation. Most surprisingly, several employees of Valenzuela Enterprises reached out to Elena anonymously, providing inside information about the company's plans, and these corporate whistleblowers revealed that the San Miguel project was more financially precarious than public statements suggested, and that any significant delays or legal development economically unfeasible. Elena found herself at the center of a move far beyond her original marketplace. The fight for San Miguel had become a broader struggles over urban development, community rights, and corporate responsibility. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities that media interviews, coordination with allied or phone calls never stopped. Strangers arrived at her apartment at all hours seeking advice or assistance. Elena realized that her life had become exhausted, stressed, struggling to maintain her relationship, felt increasingly neglected as his mother's attention was consumed by community organizing. The crisis came when Matteo brought home a school report that revealed falling grades and behavioral problems. His teacher, Mrs. Lucia, requested a conference to discuss his academic performance and emotion. Elena sat in the small classroom after hours, facing the teacher who had always been supportive of her family. Mrs. Lucia spoke gently but directly about Matteo's. He was distracted in class, argumentative with other students, and had written an essay about how important work was more valuable. The criticism was devastating because Elena recognized its accuracy. In her determination to fight for Matteo's community and future, she had neglected his immediate emotional needs. Her 8-year-old son was paying the price for her political awakening and community leadership. That night, Elena made another difficult decision. She would continue the fight against the development project, but she would also restructure her involvement to protect her relationship with Matteo. She began delegating responsibilities to other community organizers and setting boundaries around her availability. She established fixed hours for activism work and protected time for homework, meals, and conversation with her son. The changes were difficult to implement. Community organizing work felt important, but Elena gradually learned without sacrificing either responsibility. During this period of adjustment, Don Julio became even more his business experience and strategic organizing efforts. But more importantly, his presence provided stability and wisdom during the chaos. Don Julio also developed a close relationship with Matteo, serving as a grandfather figure who provided male guidance, attention that the boy craved. Their conversations about school, sports, and life helped Elena understand her son's perspective. Don Julio's health was visibly declining under. Elena noticed that he seemed sad more frequently, and sometimes appeared distracted during their strategy. One evening, Elena found Don Julio sitting alone in the marketplace, staring at the fountain where they had first met. His face was wet with tears that he didn't try to hide when she approached. For the first time since Elena, Don Julio talked openly about his love for Andres. He described the brilliant, compassionate young man his son had wore. Ambition and success had hardened his heart against his father's values. Don Julio revealed that he had tried multiple, but each attempt had been rejected. The development project represented more was a final, irrevocable break with his last destruction of his hope that their growing understanding of sacrificing not just his property rights, but his last chance at fame in order to help save her community. The weight of this sacrifice intensified. Her fight was no longer just about marketplace and protecting. It had become about honoring Don Julio's and validating his painful decision. But Elena also began to wonder whether there might be a way to resolve the conflict, a solution that could save the community while also potentially healing the relationship between father and son. Possibility she began to consider both audacious and what if she tried to reach Andres Valenzuela directly, not as a public confrontation or media event, but as a private conversation between equals. What if she could somehow help him understand not community's concerns, but his father's perspective and love? Elena knew the idea was probably naive and hopeless. Andres was surrounded by corporate advisors and public relations specialists who carefully controlled his interaction with the outside world. He had no reason to meet with her privately, and every reason to avoid any conversation that might compromise his business. But as Elena watched Don Julio's quiet pain, possible might be preferable to accepting the opportunity arose in an unexpected way that seemed to validate Elena's growing. Leo came home from school one Friday afternoon, cited news about a cultural festival that his class was supposed to research. Matteo had decided to focus on the San Miguel market, interviewing vendors about their products and family history. His enthusiasm for the project was infectious, and realized that her son was developing his own connection. What if the cultural festival could become a vehicle for showcasing value and richness of Valenzuela enterprises? Elena proposed expanding Matteo's class project into a larger community event that would highlight the marketplace vendors, local artists, traditional crafts, and cultural traditions that would be lost if the development project proceeded. Father Martinez enthusiastically supported the idea, offering the church grounds as a venue. Mrs. Carmen and other vendors volunteered to provide traditional foods. Local musicians offered to perform. The cultural festival quickly grew into a major community celebration the following month. But Elena had a secret agenda for the festival. He intended to use the event as a community he was planning, not as a business opportunity or but as a living culture with deep roots and irreplaceable. Elena knew that Andres would never respond to so she developed a more subtle strategy. He arranged for the festival to be covered by that regularly reported on Valenzuela. He made sure that the event would be described as a celebration of local heritage and tradition, emphasizing the educational cultural value rather than the political opposition. Most importantly, she ensured that the festival would include a special tribute to elderly community members who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, preserving traditions and memories that Don Julio understood immediately that Elena was seeing an opportunity for him to invite his son to attend the festival as a gesture of respect for the community elders, including his own father. The plan was emotionally risky for Don Julio, who would once again be exposing himself to rejection and humiliation from his son. But he agreed to write a letter to Andres, describing the cultural festival and expressing his hope that his community that had welcomed and supported him during their years. The letter was carefully crafted to avoid accusation or confrontation. Don Julio described the festival purely in terms of cultural preservation and community celebration, mentioning Elena only as one of the organizers, rather than as a political opponent. Elena and Don Julio knew there was little probability that Andres positively to the invitation, but the simple act of writing and sending the letter gave Don Julio a sense of closure, and Elena a feeling that they had exhausted every possible avenue for the cultural festival preparation the following month. Elena was amazed by the enthusiasm that emerged as resident performances and demonstrations of their neighbor's unique character. Miguel set up a shoe repair demonstration, showing children how traditional craft work was done by hand. Mrs. Carmen created an elaborate display of heirlooms. Rosa organized a cooking class down through generations. Mateo threw himself into the festival planning with interviewing elderly residents, practicing a presentation about the cultural importance of local markets in Latin American communities. Elena watched her son's engagement with community organizing work that had initially created tension between them, was now bringing them closer together in appreciation for the values and principles. A week before the festival, Elena received a phone call that changed everything. Andres Valenzuela's personal assistant Valenzuela would be attending the cultural festival, a private citizen interested in local heritage preservation. Elena's hands were shaking when Don Julio's letter had worked. Andres was coming to the festival, creating an opportunity for him to see the father's eyes, and potentially opening a door to dialogue that might resolve the development. But Elena also realized that Andres's attendance would enormous pressure and expectation. Community members who learned about his presence would view the festival as a political confrontation. Media coverage would focus on the drama of rather than the cultural celebration. Most importantly, Don Julio would be facing his first 5 years, with the entire community watching and the future of Elena spent the final week before the festival oscillating between hope. She had created an opportunity for breakthrough or disaster. She had no way of predicting or controlling what outcome would emerge. The morning of the cultural festival dawned perfect weather for an outdoor community. Elena arrived at the church grounds before sunrise to oversee final preparations, her stomach tight with anxiety. Vendors set up their displays with extra care, knowing that their work might be seen by the men whose company threatened their livelihoods. Musicians tuned instruments and rehearsed songs that told stories of neighborhood history and cultural tradition. Children practiced presentations that explained the significance of their family's contributions to community life. Don Julio arrived early, dressed in his best shirt and tie, his silver hair carefully combed, his face grave with nervous anticipation. Elena noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he helped arrange chairs and check sound equipment. At mid-morning, community members began arriving crafted items for the cultural displays. Atmosphere was festive and proud, but Elena sensed underlying tension, wondered whether Andres Valenzuela would actually appear and what his presence might mean for their neighborhood. Mateo was vibrating with excitement about his presentation, but he was also picking up on the adult questions that Elena couldn't fully answer. She tried to focus on supporting her son while managing the logistics event that had become much more significant than anyone had originally planned. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a small convoy of black cars pulled up out. Elena's heart began pounding as she watched Andres Valenzuela emerge from accompanied by 2 bodyguards and what appeared to be was smaller in person than he had confrontation in the marketplace. His expensive suit and confident bearing still marked him clearly as someone, but Elena was surprised by how ordinary he looked when stripped of the corporate staging and media. Andres paused at the entrance to the didn't interpret. Nervousness, perhaps. Certainly not the arrogant. Elena approached him with her heart hammered, prepared to make formal introductions and guide the cultural displays. But before she could speak, Andres's attention was caught by something across the Don Julio was standing near the traditional crafts display, talking with Miguel about shoe repair techniques. The old man's posture was straight and dignified, his voice carrying the quiet authority that Elena had recognized from their first meeting. Father and son looked at each other across 30 yards of festival grounds, surrounded by the community that had become the battleground for their conflict. The noise of conversation and music watched the most important moment of the entire festival unfold. Slowly, carefully, Andres began walking toward his father. Elena held her breath as she watched the reunion she had hoped for, but never truly expected. The community celebration continued around them, but just entirely on the 2 men whose relationship held the key. Andres reached his father, stood facing each other in silence. Elena was too far away to hear their first. We could see the emotions playing across both faces. Love and hope, years of accumulated hurt, and shook hands formally, then embraced briefly. But Elena felt tears in her eyes as she watched Don Julio introduce his family during their Over the following 2 hours, Elena observed Andres as he moved through the festival with his father. She watched him taste Mrs. Carmen's traditional foods, examine Miguel's handcrafted work, listen to Rosa's stories about supporting her children through small. Most importantly, she watched him listen to Mateo, seeing his son's intelligence and passion community connections that fighting to preserve. As the afternoon progressed, Elena noticed changes in his corporate polish gradually. He asked thoughtful questions about family histories, traditional techniques, and community relationships. He seemed particularly interested in the ways that small businesses supported and created networks of mutual assistance. But Elena also noticed moments when this community celebration was shown a development project that business advisors had never. These were not abstract obstacles to urban, but real people with deep roots and irreplaceable. Late in the afternoon, as the formal presentation, music and dancing, Andres approached Elena directly. He thanked her for organizing the festival and for the invitation that had brought him there. His words were polite and formal. Elena sensed genuine appreciation. More importantly, Andres asked if he could speak with her privately about the not as a public relations gesture, as a serious conversation between two people. Elena agreed immediately, her heart racing with hope and fear. This was the conversation she had been working. The opportunity she had never expected, had never stopped believing might be possible. They walked to a quiet corner of the church grounds, away from the festival crowds but still visible to the community members who were watching every interaction. Elena had prepared for this conversation countless times. Now that it was actually happening, she found herself speaking spontaneously from the heart, rather than from strategy. She talked about dignity, about the right to exist in the city where elderly residents like. She explained how the marketplace and surrounding neighborhood provided affordable housing, employment opportunities, and cultural connections that could never be replaced by ups. But Elena also talked about family, about the relationship between Andres and Julio that had been damaged by years of conflict over values and principles. She suggested that healing that relationship might be, and that finding a way to preserve that could become an opportunity for father and son to discover rather than irreconcilable difference. Andres listened without interruption, his expression serious and thoughtful. When Elena finished speaking, he was quiet for several minutes, processing everything he had. Finally, Andres began to speak about his own perspective on the development project, his relationship with his father. His words came slowly, as if covering his own thoughts and feelings in real. He talked about the pressure of building and maintaining a corporate empire, about the constant need to demonstrate growth and profitability to investors, nothing about community impact. But he also talked about memories of working with his father in their original construction business, about the satisfaction he had once found in building things that fill community needs, rather than generating maximum profit margins. Most significantly, Andres admitted that seeing the cultural festival he had been avoiding for years. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with both Elena and Andres on common ground. Elena realized that not the heartless corporate villain she had imagined, but a man whose success had come at the cost of connections to family. Andres seemed to recognize that Elena was a mother and community member fighting to preserve something valuable that his business plans would eliminate. When their conversation ended, Andres had made no commitments about changing but he had agreed to meet with Elena and community representatives over the following weeks to explore alternatives that might address both economic development goals and community preservation needs. More importantly, he had reconnected with his father in a context that allowed both men to see each other as allies, rather than opponents in the struggle over the neighborhood's. Elena walked home that evening, cautiously optimistic for the first. The cultural festival had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, creating opportunities for dialogue and solutions rather than zero-sum conflict. But she also knew that the real work was just corporate culture and family would not change overnight. The economic and political pressure of the original conflict continued to influence all the. Elena's role was evolving from community or activist to mediator and bridge builder, possible to connect. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself at the center of complex negotiations and community representatives, city planning officials, environmental advocates. The process was frustrating and exhausting, with setbacks and misunderstandings regularly, as different groups struggled to communicate. But gradually, a compromise solution began. Valenzuela Enterprises was preserving the existing marketplace while building a smaller commercial complex alongside new businesses. The surrounding neighborhood would be upgraded rather than demolished, with infrastructure improvements and affordable housing preservation in the development plans. Most importantly for Elena, compromise would include a community oversight role, included input from residents. The agreement was not perfect. Some vendors would still be displaced. The neighborhood would inevitably change as new businesses and residents. But the solution represented something a successful challenge to corporate power that resulted in genuine compromise rather than complete victory for either side. The personal transformation that Elena community organizing was, she had discovered capabilities and confidence that she never knew she possessed. Her relationship with Mateo had deepened as both mother and son learned about standing up for principles despite personal costs. Most importantly, Elena had moving from invisibility and isolation. Julio's health and spirits improved. Father and son started meeting, working together on gradually rebuilding trust. Elena often joined these meetings, serving as a facilitator. And have you ever lived through or known someone who went through something similar? Have you ever had to choose between personal security for what you believed was right? The resolution of the development of Elena's story, but the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Her success in organizing the community resistance led to invitations to work on using the skills and experience she had gained to help other neighborhoods facing. Elena discovered that her combination of grassroots organizing, a business knowledge gained from work, bridge building skills, developing movement for community, or eventually started her own helping communities and develop. But Elena never forgot the lessons she learned during that ordinary people have that family relationships are more valuable, and that communities are worth fighting for even when Mateo grew up with a deep understanding of social community responsibility, shaped by watching his mother transform a single mother to a respected community leader. Don Julio lived to see his son evolve toward greater social environmental consciousness, change that began with the San Miguel project and continued throughout Andres's. The marketplace that Elena fought to save became a model for community development, attracting visitors and urban planners across the region who wanted to learn about alternatives to destructive redevelopment practices. Years later, Elena would often walk through the preserved marketplace with grown-up, remembering the day she chose to defend a humiliated elderly gentleman and set in motion a chain of events that changed not just her own life, but she learned that courage is not the decision to act despite fear when something important. She discovered that dignity cannot be bought or chosen or abandoned. She understood that the most important battles are often fought by people who have everything to lose and nothing to gain except. Elena's story became a reminder that individual actions can have consequences far beyond what we imagine, and that standing up for others becomes the path to discovering our own. The elderly gentleman she defended in the marketplace had needed her protection for justice, but the courage she displayed in that moment grew into a lifetime commitment to justice, community, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to let injustice happen in front of us. Sometimes defending someone else's dignity becomes the first step toward claiming our. Elena learned that respect is earned not through wealth, but through integrity and courage. We discovered that true success not by what we acquire for ourselves, but by what we preserve and protect. The marketplace still thrives today, a living testament to the power of community organizing and the possibility of finding solutions that honor. Elena's son Mateo now commitment to community. Don Julio lived to see his grandson grow and enter a career dedicated to social. Andres Valenzuela transformed his business practices and became a leader in sustainable development, using a corporate platform to advocate for community involvement in urban planning. The story of San Miguel became a model for communities facing similar challenges around the world, proving that ordinary people have the power to influence corporate and protect the places they love. Elena's journey from invisible single mother to respected community leader demonstrates how to define our possibilities. Her willingness to defend a stranger in the marketplace, discoveries about her own strength, intelligence, and capacity that changed the trajectory of her entire life. The fight for San Miguel revealed that behind every development project are real people with real lives, real stories, and irreplaceable connections. It showed that economic growth and cultural preservation are not necessarily opposing forces, but can be balanced when decision-makers are willing to listen and consider alternatives to purely profit-driven development. Most importantly, Elena's story reminds us that courage is contagious. One person chooses to stand up for others are inspired to join them. When someone refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, they create space for hope and action that did not exist before. Today, the marketplace Elena fought to save continues to serve families, providing affordable access to fresh food, traditional crafts, and the kinds of small businesses that create the community organizing skills. During the campaign, same tools she used for the rest of her life, helping other neighborhoods, other families, other ordinary people discover their own power to create change. The relationship between Don Julio and his son Andres, healed through their shared commitment to finding just solutions for the San Miguel community, became a model for how families can overcome ideological differences by focusing on shared values and common ground. Elena's story is ultimately about the power of love. Love for community, love for family, love for justice, and love for the belief that ordinary people can create ordinary change when they act with courage and integrity. If this story resonated with you, give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next. Share it with someone who might need to hear about the power we all have to stand up for what matters. Odds seem impossible. Remember that every act of courage, no matter how small it seems in the moment, has the potential to change everything. Remember that dignity and respect can only be earned through our actions and choices. Remember that communities are worth fighting for, and that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to use it. Elena's story continues in every person who chooses community over convenience, courage over fear. It lives on in every neighbor who what they value, in every family that prioritizes profit, in every individual who refuses out response. What will your story be?